Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is how, once upon a time, and not very long ago, it was axiomatic that the United States' support for Israel was ironclad and crossed over the aisle. That election after election, term after term, almost every member of Congress appreciated just how important Israel was and how essential it was to support Israel. Support for Israel was in America's best interest. Support for Israel was the right thing to do. But that was then, and now things have changed. U.S. support for Israel is no longer unwavering. It's no longer a congressional given. The National Defense Authorization Act, better known as the NDAA, is about to be passed by Congress. It is the allocation of monies for Defense Department. In the NDAA is an allocation of $735 million sales of two types of Boeing missiles to Israel. The missiles are a replacement for the bombs used by Israel in May in the course of that 11-day war with Gaza. These are surgical strike weapons, and they have proven extremely effective. The bill will pass, but at the last minute, Representatives AOC of New York, Rashida Tlaib of Detroit, Michigan, and Mark Pocan of Kenosha, Wisconsin, submitted an amendment to the act. They're asking for a total suspension of all arms sales to Israel for 1 year. In real terms, this amendment will never be approved. It was submitted too late, and the House Rules Committee would not have passed it anyway. The Rules Committee is the powerhouse in the House. It is in this committee that drafts are set before going to the House vote. Now, if the committee is against the proposal, there is no chance of the proposal going anywhere. But that's not the essential point here. The essential point here is that these three members of Congress, and others whose names are not attached to the amendment, want to stop military aid to Israel. These representatives argue that it is illegal for U.S. military aid, and for that matter, any aid to go to Israel. They claim that Israel is killing innocent Palestinians. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, they've got it backwards. It is the terrorists of Gaza firing rockets into Israel that are targeting innocents. Indiscriminately, they point and shoot their rockets, and wherever they land, they land. Of course, should the rockets kill people and damage population centers, all the better. But they have no specific targets, and their only goal is to kill as many Israelis as possible. Actually, their rockets are incredibly inaccurate. So much so that over 20% of them never make it out of Gaza. They fall and kill and injure Gazans. 680 errant rockets, another 280 ended up in the sea. That's what happened in this last 11 days. During 11 days in May, their own rockets killed 91 Gazans. Dozens of others were injured. An electricity relay station was destroyed. And then they had the gall to demand that the Israeli electric company repair the station that they had destroyed. I would call that chutzpah, Hamas style. Israel is defending itself. Hamas, and now the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, do not make it easy. Both terrorist groups fire their rockets from civilian centers, and even from media centers. Before an Israeli attack, Israel drops leaflets, sends SMS messages alerting people and encouraging them to leave the intended target. In one case, I witnessed it. I saw the video. Israel called the security desk of a building and asked how long it would take to evacuate the building. The response was 2 to 3 hours. In 2 hours, Israel called back to ascertain that the building was indeed empty of civilians. Journalists covering the war from the Gaza side were so secure of Israel's accuracy that they actually positioned themselves on the roof across the street from the building, set up their cameras to film the Israeli bombing of the building across the street. The bombs came, there was a small cloud, and then the building imploded, and there was a much larger cloud as the dust settled, and all that remained was a heap of dirt and destruction. Nothing else was damaged, not on either side of the building. Not the cars in the street. No person was injured, just dust. The building housed 2 media groups and a Hamas computer office. Those computers needed to be destroyed in Israel's eyes. Everyone does not have to agree with Israel. Everyone need not support Israel on every issue. But to think that Israel is wrong in defending herself or to think that she is not doing enough to prevent the deaths of Gazans who are used as human shields by their own Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the terrorists, then if they think that way, I think their thinking is warped. As members of Congress move away from support of Israel, I wonder, how can anyone with a heart and a conscience really support Hamas? Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from Ynet. It's dated September 18th, and it's penned by Elisha Ben-Kimon. The title of the column is Israel Must Restrain Emerging Terror Wave Before It Escalates. And the subtitle is Opinion. Palestinian attacks that result in wounded or dead Israelis usually tend to inspire copycats. Therefore, security forces must adopt an uncompromising method of dealing with lone terrorists before it's too late. Ben-Kimon warns that Israel must crack down on terror. That sounds obvious. She posits that the ripple effect of successful terror is more and more terror. She's correct. There is no room for slacking off when it comes to acts of terror. This is how Ben-Kimon begins. A single terror attack could potentially lead to a wave of terror attacks, and it's largely dependent on who is on the receiving end. It could be a soldier stationed at an outpost, a security guard at a gate, a police officer at a checkpoint, or a simple passerby at a bus station. Each one of them has the capability to prevent a stabbing or a shooting from occurring without any casualties, and their actions would have a direct effect on whether another attack takes place. The past has taught us that attacks which result in Israelis getting hurt or killed tend to inspire copycats to carry out more attacks. The IDF commanders and soldiers are familiar with this phenomenon from their experience in the West Bank and other areas beyond the Green Line, and only a quick and uncompromising action will prevent the current tensions in the area from escalating. Ben-Kimon explains that during the natural sequences of daily life and events in Israel, terrorists, especially lone wolves and small cells, can gain motivation to attack Israel. She writes, in the wake of the manhunt for the remaining Gilboa prison fugitives, alleged diplomatic talks with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's meeting with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, terrorist organizations are trying to ignite a fresh wave of violence. 3 terror attacks in 3 days in both the West Bank and Jerusalem remind us of October 2015, when attacks carried out by young lone terrorists resulted in the so-called Knives Intifada. Kimon cites a very important conclusion that the IDF came to regarding Palestinian terror attacks, their motivation and operations. She writes, at the time, the IDF concluded that in that particular terror wave, future attacks largely depended on success of the previous ones and the number of wounded or dead Israelis. So when IDF soldiers began using aggressive and precise actions to foil attacks in the West Bank with no casualties, the wave finally subsided. Ben-Kimon concludes with an admonition to Israel to be vigilant and not let its guard down. In her words, in the wake of the war, lone terrorists attempted to carry out attacks in the West Bank and Jerusalem, but failed thanks to the awareness and quick reaction of the soldiers. Similar methods are being used during violent Palestinian riots. The IDF deploys with large forces in the West Bank ahead of the riots in order to suppress them on time, before they expand to Jewish communities. These actions make Palestinian terrorists think twice before they attempt to conduct an attack. So, in order to prevent the current tensions from developing into a terror wave, we must use the same methods being used in the West Bank inside Israel, and finish those encounters before they start, as quick as possible and with no casualties. This piece is very insightful. Stopping terror without casualties before it starts? The problem is, of course, that sounds a lot easier on paper than it is in reality. Next up is a column by Ben-Dror Yemini, and it was published on September 13th, 2021, also in Ynet. It's entitled, The Fascists Who Justify Terrorism, subtitled Opinion. Whether on the right or on the left, those who sympathize and justify bloodshed and terror, be it Jewish or Palestinian, are no better than the ones they claim to abhor, and those cheering on the Gilboa fugitives are no better. Ben-Dror is one of the clearest thinkers in the world of Israeli commentary, This is another example of his excellent thought and critique of a very dangerous moral problem that needs to be checked. Keep in mind that this piece was written before all the fugitives were found and returned to prison. Even so, this column is worthy of our time and discussion. This is how he begins. Israel's fascist right wing has thrown around a lot of serious accusations in recent days following the escape of 6 Palestinian security prisoners from Gilboa prison last week. Some accuse the entire Palestinian nation of being bloodthirsty. Are some of them bloodthirsty? Probably. Are all of them bloodthirsty? Of course not. How are we supposed to treat a person who utters such racist bile? Despicable as it may be, those who voice their support for the 6 fugitives who all have blood on their hands are even worse. Ben-Dror goes on to explain why this is morally wrong, and I might add, Jewishly reprehensible. He continues, one example is a left-wing activist with whom I'm actually acquainted, who wrote the surprising joy he felt after reading about the 6 terrorists' escape. As much as I tried, I could not fathom the joy that this person feels about the escape of 6 murderers who would have most likely continued on their path of violence had 4 of them not been caught so soon. According to this activist and his ilk, the Palestinian struggle is a righteous one. It is not that they crave bloodshed, but simply have to fight out of necessity in order to defeat the occupation. Ben-Dror Yemini explains what the problem is when you support terrorists and terrorism. As he puts it, it is impossible not to sympathize with the determination and creativity of those people who dug in the soil of Gilboa prison to win their freedom, wrote one agitator who received thousands of likes on social media. The Palestinian people are oppressed, devastated, enslaved, and at the mercy of our children and our leaders, who hold them by the neck. The agitator added in the past that was written as if it came straight from Hamas' own PR machine. A struggle for freedom, for liberation, for independence can certainly evoke empathy, even when it comes to one's opponent. The problem is that the struggle of Zakaria Zubeidi and his compatriots was and remains a murderous one, meant to eliminate the Jewish entity from Israel. Ben-Dror Yemini now gives perspective as he writes that the Palestinians have never accepted a deal for statehood. He continues, let us not forget that the Palestinians continuously rejected any and all offers for independence. They always said no to any repeated proposal that would have granted them freedom. They could have easily established the state in the 2 decades between the War of Independence, 1948, and the Six-Day War, 1967. Back then, there was no such thing as an Israeli occupation, and yet the Palestinians did nothing to establish a state for themselves. Instead, they always fought against the Jewish entity and the very existence of the State of Israel. He concludes with a very serious and important lesson. It is true that we have fascists on both the right and the left. Anyone who shows sympathy for Jewish terrorism, whoever encourages and justifies it, is a fascist. Anyone who shows sympathy for Arab terrorism, encourages it and justifies it, is also a fascist. What's puzzling is that when it comes to terrorists on the Jewish side, we know how to call them racists. So now it's time to put those who sympathize and justify Palestinian terrorism in their place. They are fascist, not unlike their counterparts on the right. Ben-Dror Yemini is 100% correct. We must stand up against fascism and racism and openly acknowledge that any justification of Palestinian terror is simply an acknowledgement of racism. An excellent piece. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 7 cartoons and memes and headlines today. First up is a cartoon about the press, specifically the New York Times. It attacks the inaccuracy of reporting. A young man is in a library asking the librarian for copies of the New York Times. The librarian answers, that would be in the fiction section. Unfortunately, it's not simply the New York Times, it's all over the media. Pieces that are labeled as news stories are more and more often contrived and exaggerated, and that's a shame. This next is a headline which reads, Oxford University students allowed to take open book exams due to lack of practice. Imagine that type of accommodation in a world-class top-level university. What is happening? This next headline reads, Boy 4 accidentally buys $2.6 thousand worth of SpongeBob popsicles on Amazon. I actually know a similar story, but it was hundreds, not thousands of dollars. When I read this story the first time, I wondered how they keep the popsicles frozen. I assume dry ice. But how do you safely dispose of the dry ice? Don't even ask how the kids got the credit card numbers. Next up is a funny play on filling out forms online. Bob Barker of The Price is Right fame watches as someone spins the wheel, and the caption reads, How I feel when I have to scroll down to the year I was born. That's a funny commentary about computers. Next is a meme, a true observation about our society and our phones. The meme reads, When I was a kid, there were no phones or tablets. We read cereal boxes at breakfast. When leaves change colors and begin to fall off the trees, it's a sign that the fall season has begun. This funny observation reads, You know it's fall in Florida when the license plate's colors begin to change. This last meme is a biting critique of humor and on humor, especially late night humor, a genre that has become unfunny and totally politicized. This meme depicts Johnny Carson, and it simply reads, I remember when late night comedy shows were actually funny. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett explained why he will not meet with the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Bennett gave Ynet the reasons for his decision. He said, My perspective is different than that of the defense minister. Although we work in harmony, I oppose the Palestinian state, and I think it would be a grave mistake to import the failed Gaza model of Hamas, which shoots rockets at us, and turn the entire West Bank to that. Bennett also explained why the defense minister Benny Gantz met with Abbas and why he can and should continue to meet with him. Bennett explained that Gantz has different issues and different variables at play when deciding to meet with Abbas. But for him, it's a very different situation. Bennett said, I see no logic in meeting Abbas when he's suing our soldiers in The Hague and accuses our commanders of war crimes. In my opinion, the Palestinian Authority is a failed entity. The government is acting in concert. There are no secrets among Israeli leaders now. For the first time in a decade, an Israeli prime minister went to Egypt publicly. Publicly, I say, because there were private meetings, but this is public. Egypt is the very first Arab country to sign a peace treaty with Israel. But over the past few years, the relationship has cooled. That might be changing. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett traveled to Egypt to meet with Egyptian President al-Sisi. The meeting took place at the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh, located at the very southern tip of the Sinai Desert. The most significant purpose of this Egyptian-Israeli talk was to come up with a plan to jumpstart talks between Israel and the Palestinians. Additionally, Bennett and al-Sisi were able to discuss regional tensions in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and of course Iran and Iran's influence in the region. By the meeting's end, al-Sisi volunteered to host an Israeli-Palestinian summit. The question is, will the Palestinians accept the invitation? Israel's Prime Minister commented on the FDA's decision to support the third vaccine only for high-risk people and people over 65. Naftali Bennett predicted that the United States will gradually begin to offer the vaccine more widely after being presented with the scientific data from Israel. On Twitter, Bennett asserted that the FDA decided to follow in Israel's path. I estimate that the FDA will gradually approve the extension of the vaccine to more age groups, as has happened in Israel, as the effectiveness of the second vaccine continues to decline, even among younger age groups. The FDA decision will make people uneasy about the vaccine. If it is good for those over 65, it should be good for those under 65 also. In fact, 2.8 million senior adults in Israel have already received their third vaccine. Third vaccine. That is almost everyone eligible for the booster. and Israel is already securing and preparing a fourth vaccine. The reason should be clear. There is no way to know what will happen next. A fourth shot may be necessary, and necessary around the bend. In an interview on the radio, on channel 103 FM, Nachman Ash, Israel's Health Ministry Director General, explained the thinking this way. We don't know when it will happen. I hope very much that it won't be within the next 6 months, like this time, and that the third dose will last for longer. Most countries haven't figured out how to vaccinate their citizens in a first round. Israel is already preparing for a fourth round. Countries around the world are beginning to create agreements allowing for travel, as long as the travelers have COVID certificates. Israel and the EU, the European Union, have agreed on mutual recognition of their certificates for coronavirus vaccinations. The move enables Israelis in Europe to apply for and receive local green passes, which will give them the ability to enter restaurants, cultural events, and public buildings. European citizens will enjoy reciprocal status in Israel. The problem with the agreement is that it allows each EU country to decide on its own whether or not it wants Israelis. It does not prevent individual countries within the EU from restricting Israelis. Despite that caveat, this is an important step forward towards normalization, even as the world is witnessing spikes in the Delta variant. Economy for security. That, in a nutshell, is Israel's plan to bring quiet to Israel from Gaza. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid has laid out his plan in detail. Lapid actually presented his outline in an address at the International Counterterrorism Conference at Reichman University, formerly called the IDC, the Interdisciplinary College. The plan was dubbed Economy for Security and will include 2 phases. Phase 1 will be humanitarian rehabilitation for Gaza in return for combating Hamas's efforts to increase its military capabilities. Phase 2 will see the Palestinian Authority take control of civil and economic affairs in the enclave. Sounds simple, sounds easy, on paper again. We will see what happens when reality sets in. The Taliban has announced, let's say, that they are not at all interested in diplomatic ties with Israel. What do you know? What a surprise. The surprise is that they made the announcement in the first place. Taliban spokesman Shahul Shaheen spoke to Sputnik News Service, a Russian news outlet, and said that the Taliban would cooperate with the United States. He said, "Of course we will not have any relations with Israel. We want to have relations with other countries. Israel is not among these countries. Yes, of course, if America wants a relationship with us, which could be in the interest of both countries and both peoples, and if they want to participate in the reconstruction of Afghanistan, they are welcome." The Taliban has already named a provincial government, and that government includes several people wanted for terror offenses. Among that group are Mullah Mohammed Hassan Arkund, a veteran of the group who was on the UN sanctions list and served as Islamist regime's brutal leader between 1996 and 2001. He was named as acting prime minister. And now we have Shuardin Haqqani, who was wanted by the FBI and suspected involvement in the 2008 terror attack in Kabul that killed 6 people, including an American, and other alleged offenses. He has a $10 million bounty on his head, and he was named as acting interior minister. Taliban co-founder Abdul Ghani Baradar will be the deputy prime minister. He previously served as the head of the movement's political office, overseeing the 2020 signing of the U.S. withdrawal agreement. Mullah Yaqub, son of the Taliban founder and late Supreme Leader Mullah Omar, was named defense minister. There was an attack in Syria. The attack struck a gas line that powered an electricity station. On the state news agency in Syria, Sana, Syria's electricity minister said and acknowledged that an attack on one of the gas lines at Deir Ali station led to an electricity outage that affected the capital of Damascus, its outskirts, and other areas, and that repair was working and going on. The minister told state TV that the electricity was expected to return to Damascus within an hour of the announcement, and that it was able to return it to all affected areas. The Islamic State, ISIS, claimed responsibility for the attack. According to a statement published on their affiliated stations. ISIS is alive and well. Moderna has announced that it is developing a single vaccine that combines a booster dose against COVID-19 with an experimental flu shot. Stephanie Bancel, CEO of Moderna, presented an update during a presentation to investors on the company's drugs in development. During the presentation, Bancel said, "We believe this is a very large opportunity that is ahead of us. If we could bring to market a high-efficacy pan-respiratory annual booster, we believe Moderna could be the first to market in this important new opportunity." The drug maker already had several influenza vaccine candidates in development before the coronavirus hit. This new vaccine combines the experimental flu shot that is the furthest along together with the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. The company has already started clinical trials for a vaccine appropriate for older adults. Novavax, another pharmaceutical company, has also announced that it has initiated early-stage study to test the combined flu and COVID-19 vaccines. This is a major step forward. By combining the vaccines into a single booster injection, recipients will bolster their overall protection against flu and COVID. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Ben-Dror Yemini wrote about morality. In Judaism, there is an obligation to act morally. Most everyone knows that. There are so many biblical and rabbinic citations making that demand, an expectation on us. Let's look at just one, and I chose an example of my namesake, the prophet Micah, or Micah, who asked, "What does God demand of you?" In Micah 6:8, chapter 6, line 8, we have what is arguably the best synopsis of proper human behavior and what is expected of us. It is the classical social contract for a person and their society. Here's the quote. "He told you, human, what is good and what God seeks from you, but doing justice and loving kindness and walking in humility with your God." That says it all. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.